The first thing that comes to mind, if I look back, over the past 28 years of my life, is something my parents kind of instilled in me from a very young age, which is just kind of I've always set like mini goals for myself, and what I mean by that is I kind of look at life as like a huge game. Basically, there's like different levels and different bosses you have to overcome and beat, and after you beat one level in the game, you kind of advance to the second level. So I'm always just looking, you know, I think I've done this for my entire life. I was just kind of looking, where do I want to go in my life? Where do I want, and then I think about how to get there. And then I think about, what are the small steps I can take to get there? So if you look at, what I'm doing now as an example, like my entire life, I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur. And then very recently, one of my old bosses gave me very good advice when I was thinking about what to do next. And he said, if you want to be an entrepreneur, what steps do you have to take to get there? And once you start thinking about your life like that, then it decreases the odds of you making a bad decision. So I never took jobs for money. I never took jobs for any other reasons other than, will this put me one step closer to becoming an entrepreneur? And I've always had that type of mentality for everything else that I was doing, whether it's sports, where I went to live. If you think about New York, it's where I live now. So everything in my life has been, where do I want to go and how to get there. And the unique thing that's happened is that now it feels like the stakes in the games are getting higher. So it's like now that you reach that, then you start thinking about, oh wow, I really never thought that would happen. But what's the next thing that I could try to go for? And I think it's just that kind of mentality is kind of how I framed my life. I also know the trap of the grass is always greener. So I've already started thinking about, where does this game stop? Because hopefully it's not like Monopoly where the game just goes on forever. Skillshare is a community marketplace for offline classes, so it allows people to literally learn anything from anyone. So if you want to take a class on chocolate making or fundraising for your startup or, calculus, I don't even know. You could take a class on that through our site. When we start talking about the vision behind Skillshare, we tell people that we want to turn every city and every community into a big school or a big campus, turn every single address and turn every single venue into a possible classroom, and turn every single person that lives in those cities into students and teachers. So while people say like NYU and Columbia are great universities, we would say that the city of New York can be one of the best universities in the entire world, and we could really use the power of the internet to really do that. And for us, at the end of the day, what we really want to do is really disrupt education and really democratize learning. And a lot of people are doing the same thing. A lot of companies are trying to achieve that same goal. And I think education is a massive problem. It's very complex, and I think there should be more companies trying to solve the problem from so many different angles. And I think when that happens is when you can really move a very archaic institution into the right direction. If you look at the history of disruption and innovation, everything that drives that is very bottom up. And that's just how the internet works. Everything on the internet, it's very democratic and very bottom up. And I think that's the major difference. We don't find the teachers, the teachers kind of find us, and they create their own curriculums and courses. If we're playing a baseball game, I think we're at the top of the first inning. So I think there's going to be a lot more challenges coming up, and I think the stuff we've gone through is probably nothing compared to what we're about to go through. And we're still a very new company, and we still had a lot of growing pains, and we still do. We're young entrepreneurs. We're first-time entrepreneurs as well. So a lot of the problems we're facing is going to be around that. I think on the other side, a lot of the problems we're facing is, how do we grow this into how do we turn the world into a big school? That's really our end goal, and I just think there's going to be a lot of obstacles that are just going to get thrown at us. But as entrepreneurs, by nature, we're creative problem solvers, so I'm pretty confident if we surround ourselves with really, really smart people that are very passionate about our vision and our mission, we can pretty much overcome any obstacle that gets thrown our way. If you talk to anyone that wants to disrupt something, is in their head they kind of see where it goes. So in my head, I think what you see right now, since we're only 2.5 months oh, it's like 1%, it's like the tip of the iceberg. I think 5, 10, 15, 20 years, it would be amazing to see accreditations coming out of skills of companies like Skillshare and others. I think having, you know, a stamp of approval from Foursquare that you're a great location-based developer is more valuable than having, or just as valuable as having a degree from a top university. I think walking down the street and seeing physical schools literally pop up, literal physical buildings, where people in the community go and they teach and learn from each other, and they use websites and the internet like Skillshare to facilitate the online to offline interactions. I also think it'll be really interesting to see outside of Skillshare. One thing that I think I'll work on for the rest of my life is offering alternatives to people that don't want to go to college. I think it'll be really interesting to see creative schools pop up. I think it'll be really interesting to see innovation schools pop up. I think it'll be really interesting to see 18-year-old students getting grants to pursue things they're passionate about to change the world versus getting scholarships to schools. I think stuff like that is how you really start disrupting education. I believe in competition, but healthy competition. I think without that, things become stagnant, and you just need that for true innovation and disruption to happen. Second thing was actually advice I got from the guys at Airbnb, and I asked them that same question. You know, how should we start thinking about all the people that are starting copying our idea? And then thing those guys told me, which is so smart and accurate, and I'm pretty sure someone else told it to them. So you don't really have to worry about competitors if you're playing in a market that's so massive. The only time you ever have to worry about a competitor is when you're Facebook and you're as big as MySpace and you guys are competing against each other. But it's very rare for companies to get to that stage. I mean, if you still think of this today, Pepsi and Coke are still big businesses doing the same thing essentially, right? So for us, I think, you know, there's a different paradigm of competition coming out where, you know, it is for the greater good, and, you know, some companies will succeed and some companies will fail. But I think what we'll start seeing as a trend is companies working more with each other than against each other, and patting each other on the back and saying, that was really good, let me see if I can one-up that. Because if I do, it's making the world better. So it's like a very healthy competition is what I see happening. And when everyone says, what do you think of this company, what do you think of that company? And our stance is that's amazing, and I wish 1,000 more people would copy that idea. And it's just a pure numbers game. And I think we'll start seeing stuff like that happening when people try to disrupt education or healthcare or banking or politics. It's like, you know, I always encourage young entrepreneurs to stop building photo sharing apps and start disrupting industries. And I think what we'll start seeing in the business world is the younger generation really embracing that and helping each other, you know, for the greater good. I think the biggest thing I've learned is patience. I think when I was younger, you know, I wanted to be an entrepreneur when I was like 20, 21, but I just wasn't ready back then. And what I tell a lot of people is when you're very patient, great things happen. And what I mean by that is when I was younger, you know, I think I learned a lot because I executed so many things. So I think that the two lessons is patience and execution. And what I mean by those two things is they kind of went hand in hand, because I went through this phase where I just worked on so many ideas and I executed so many things and I just pushed so much stuff out in the world. And through that experience, I learned that I wasn't ready to be an entrepreneur and that I still have a lot of learning to do. And I think much like people climb a corporate ladder, the entrepreneurial ladder is the same thing. You climb an idea ladder, and you only can climb that through experience and execution. So for the past 3 to 5 years of my life, you know, I've on the side worked on a lot of things, but I also shadowed, you know, a lot of other CEOs and entrepreneurs and worked with them and learned a lot. And when the timing was right to launch Skillshare, I'm glad that it did. One thing that I've noticed is a lot of people think that, and you'll hear this all the time, that all these startups and entrepreneurs and companies are overnight successes. And it goes back to my earlier point of patience. If you think about the example of Foursquare and the guys that started that, this has actually been like a 7-year ordeal for them, or 5 to 7 years. Like, they started a company when they were in college, or Dennis did, called Dodgeball, because he was obsessed with solving that one problem. of connecting people in cities through technology. And then that got acquired by Google, and then he took a year or two off. Then he came back again, second time, and launched Foursquare, solving the same problem. And I think it's so successful, and nobody will ever beat that team because him and Naveen have been thinking about the same problem for years, And if Foursquare happens to fail, they'll come back for a third time and they'll hack at it again. I just look at it as just being very patient. There really is no rush. And that's something I'm starting to embrace a lot more right now, is that going too fast can be detrimental, and there's nothing wrong with taking the scenic route versus taking the HOV lane. I think a big societal shift that needs to happen, that's already happening, is I think a lot of people need to question the way things are done. And what I mean by that is a lot of people take a lot of things for granted and as the way things should happen because it's the way it's always happened. And I think we're coming to that inflection point where people could start really questioning things and figuring out solutions of how to make it better. And I think what's starting to happen is a lot of people are really looking at the big institutions and figuring out how to change that. And if you look at what's happened over the past couple of years with the financial crash, like any sane average person, when I read about it or hear about it, I just can't understand how that can happen. And I take a lot of things for granted that someone else is kind of keeping that in check and keeping that balance. But in reality, human beings, they just make a lot of mistakes. And when mistakes compound, horrible things happen. And I hope that there are young entrepreneurs or young future leaders that are 12, 13, 14, or 15 that see that stuff and get really obsessed with figuring out how to solve that. And by the time they become mature enough to really pursue those options and figuring out solutions that they do, and that there's an infrastructure that allows them to fail, in a culture that embraces innovation and disruption and failure. And I think that's starting to happen. I think even 3 years ago, the idea of entrepreneurship was just known but not accepted. And what we're starting to see today is a lot of universities and colleges adopting that into the curriculums. I think we're starting to see a lot of, it's kind of cool to be a startup or entrepreneur. And what I hope happens in 3 to 5 years is that it's really cool to, challenge the status quo.